Welcome to our next unit, which is clinical psychology. We are going to be learning about perspectives and how we explain behavior. We're going to be looking at various psychological disorders, and then we're going to look at how we treat those disorders. Before we get started with the lesson, I do have some important dates. Our retakes for units 5 and 6 are still on for Friday. You need to make sure that you have the test correction sent to me beforehand because I won't allow you to retake it. And if you don't do it by this date, you'll have to wait for last chance retakes. So again, you have to make sure that you have those test corrections. Some people were asking about the Unit 7 retake, which is the test that we just took, and it's going to be the week after we get back from break. So remember, this is all a rolling grade. It's cumulative, so it'll change for the semester grade. So we're going to do this April 8th and April 12th. When we come back after break, we actually only have 3 days together, and then we have another break because of Good Friday and then a PLD. Okay, so that's why it's so much longer. And then the AP exam is coming. It's less than 2 months. And I did find out that it's going to be in the ref, which I'm actually pretty glad about. We can definitely have that 6 feet. I think for the ACT, they were 10 feet apart. So it is in the field house. And more information as I learn it. So what are we studying here in clinical psychology? So today's our introduction to clinical psych, and we're going to really lay the foundation for the unit. Then when we return from break, we're going to look at anxiety and trauma related disorders. And then, which is going to be like, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and then some other disorders you may not have learned about, which are somatic and dissociative disorders. And then lesson 8.3 is going to be mood and coping. And so the former disorders, or mood is the former name, but it would be like depression and bipolar disorder. And then we're going to take a look at eating disorders, addiction disorders. And then I thought there was another one, but we'll maybe not. And then 8.4, I am still kind of working on the name. For delusional disorders, we're going to be looking at schizophrenia and personality disorders. So that will encompass various degrees of schizophrenia, and then looking at a few personality disorders like antisocial personality and border personality more in depth. And then we're going to look at the treatment of disorders in lesson 8.5. So before we get started, I really like to lay the groundwork for how we approach this unit. So this is going to be Brene Brown, which some of you may have heard of her before. She's pretty fantastic. She's an author and a speaker. And here she is talking about empathy. And just for reference for everybody, this is going to be part 1 of the FAST assignment. You're going to do a reflection on this. So I'm going to show this video and then do a little bit of explaining, and then we'll look at the FAST assignment.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay. So I don't want you to write this down, but you will be reflecting on this in the FAST assignment. So when we're looking at empathy, there's a few things that I am going to ask of you for this unit. The first is something called people first language, where we recognize the person before the disease. So an example here would be rather than calling somebody bulimic or an alcoholic or schizophrenic, we would identify them as their person. So this is a person with schizophrenia. This is a person with alcoholism. And I know that may seem just like semantics, like we're just doing wordplay here or wordsmithing. But the issue is especially with psychiatric illnesses, the person is recognized as that illness. If somebody has heart disease, we say they have heart disease. We don't say they're heart diseasic. Okay, so just kind of consider that when you're talking about people with illness. Also, be open-minded, because sometimes we are going to see things that are unusual and uncomfortable. So I'm going to really encourage you to think before you react. So if we're watching somebody who is in a manic episode, they do have a severe psychological illness, and what we're seeing is abnormal, not something that we're used to seeing. But just really think about how you're going to react and really try to practice that empathy. You may be uncomfortable, and that's okay. We're going to really push it today with this scenario. So really be conscientious of your behaviors and your reactions. Okay. So now what I would like you to do is you can pause this video, and I would like you to complete FAST 8.1 Part 1 Empathy. So welcome back, and we are going to move on to part 2, which is abnormal psych. So you can kind of keep this open or just have it in the background. But we are going to be looking at how do we decide what behavior is abnormal, and we have 3 different approaches. I am not going to put the definitions in my in the presentation. You certainly are welcome to, but I think after you do a few examples and we do the adult baby analysis, it'll make sense as to how we define abnormal behavior. So let's take a look at definitions of abnormal behavior. And what we're looking at here is 3 key areas. The first area is the statistical frequency approach, and we're really looking at when we look at 100% of the population, if only 1% of the population does this behavior, it's probably abnormal. Statistically, it's abnormal. When we look at social norms approach, we are looking at what is the expected behaviors of an age group of people in society, and are you violating that social norm? And then finally, is it maladaptive? Is it harming the individual? Okay, and again, you can reference these on your FAST assignment with the definitions of abnormal behavior. So this maladaptive one is the one that we really are going to focus on when we look at psychological disorders, because it's preventing the individual from coping with normal stressors of everyday life. All right, so let's take a look at a few examples of the statistical frequency, and you can write these in your FAST assignment. And what I would do in your notes is just put like reference FAST 8.1, something like that. So you know that you have this when you're studying and you can go back and open it up. So if we were to look at green eyes, okay, that according to the statistical frequency approach, this would be abnormal because only 8.11% of people have green eyes. We could look that hazel is abnormal and blue is abnormal, okay, because if we just look at that compared to everybody else. So statistically, green eyes are the most rare, which technically makes it abnormal, okay? Not that if you have green eyes, you're abnormal. I'm just using it as a example. So how do we look at this with disorders? So if we look at it with the statistical frequency here, we have that any disorder is roughly 18.6%. Okay, so statistically that's abnormal when you compare it to 100%. Let's go down to OCD, okay, which is obsessive compulsive on the bottom. 1.2% of the population has OCD. That makes it statistically abnormal. Now, does that mean it's maladaptive? Okay, in this case, yes, but it's going to be a different definition. So here I have a GIF of somebody cutting the line. Okay, so like why, I want you to think about this. Why do you wait in line? Okay, like if you were to wait in line at a movie theater, okay, you know you have to stand at the end of the line and not just cut to the front. Okay, no one is telling you you have to do that. You just know that that's the social norm. Okay, so if we look here, like somebody who is homeless, okay, so is this violating a social norm, okay, for somebody who is homeless? Well, if we look at that, most people live in a building, okay, so that would be statistical frequency, but the expected behavior is that you live in a building. So this would be a violation of a social norm. So making homelessness an abnormal behavior. Okay, so now let's look at maladaptive. So we have here I have a graph of people who are inmates in prisons in California, and I don't know how they're how they're operationally defining mentally ill. This could be somebody with anxiety. This could be somebody with depression. I don't think we could. It's fair to say that like 45% of inmates have schizophrenia. Okay, but we have maladaptive, and this is affecting their ability to function in society. So when we look here, if these people, if their illness is affecting their ability because they're in prison and it's related to their illness, that would be maladaptive. Here, somebody with depression may not be able to do everyday tasks. Okay, so somebody who has to lay in bed most of the day and can't get out of bed to shower, okay, that is definitely interfering with their well-being. Okay, so I have to go to YouTube apparently to watch this. See if it'll take me there. So this video is intentionally uncomfortable. And I really hope that it comes up here. Okay, I don't need that long of one, just 1 second. Okay, so I found it. Now, if I were in person, this video really does make me cringe. And the reason that I selected this video is so that we can really practice empathy. And we are going to decide, you're going to do this on the FAST assignment. Does this behavior fall underneath abnormal for statistical frequency, for social norms, and then for maladaptive behavior? So this, I think, is from My Strange Addiction or something. I'm not sure. So we are going to watch it. You're going to probably be uncomfortable, and that's okay. I chose it intentionally for that reason. Here we go.
Stanley, time to get up. Hey, Stanley. Wakey, wakey.
I like to play or be treated as a baby.
Hi, puppy.
Just to get the love and affection, safeness. basically just go back to a time where you're caring for a 1 or 2 year old, and that's what it is for me.
Okay.
29-year-old Stanley Thornton spends around half his life pretending to be an infant. He calls himself an adult baby.
You miss me?
With being an adult baby, I've had a couple different reactions, some good, some not so good. I've had some people that are perfectly fine with it, and I've had others that are just angry, like they think that it's an automatic that you're a pedophile because you're into it.
Angela, you need to cut your hair. It's getting too long. You start to look like a little girl.
Stanley shares a house with former nurse Sandra Diaz. She's not Stanley's mom, but is happy to play that role.
I love him like he's my favorite nephew. He's like my family member who lost his mother, and it's like I'm the aunt stepping in saying, it's okay, I'm still here for you.
To step into Stanley and Sandra's modest home is to enter a fantasy world where a grown man plays with Legos, sucks on a pacifier, is spoon-fed, uses baby talk, and even wears a diaper. It's a life of make-believe that many would consider taboo.
Or if I do, he is sure to cry.
I think our cultural norms tell us that we're supposed to be babies, and then we grow up and we go through teenage, and then we become adults, you know, and if somebody is trying to jump back, then that feels uncomfortable, and people feel threatened by something that's out of the ordinary.
To avoid public shaming, Stanley switches to adult mode when he leaves the house. This afternoon, he's at a hardware store buying wood for an upcoming DIY project. A supersized high chair.
The high chair started 2 years ago as a small project. I've been working on the plans for about a year and a half. So I wanted to create something that was modular and could hold my weight, because I'm not exactly a little guy.
Stanley's already customized other baby furniture to make his fantasy life feel more real.
This is my nursery, and this is my crib. It took me about a day to build it and another day to paint it. This particular side goes up and down, the other one's stationary. I like it. It's very comfortable. It's easy to get into the baby feel while you're in it. I mean, there's nothing else like it, waking up in a crib as opposed to a bed. And sleeping in the crib, you wake up as a child and you can continue on from there. And it's easy to stay in the same mindset. I got my hands on a baby-sized play yard that I converted for adult weight. Didn't take much more than putting a inch-thick board in the bottom, and it goes from supporting 60 pounds to about 350 pounds.
Stanley knows many people might regard his lifestyle as bordering on insanity. There was a time he would have agreed with them.
I started getting into it when I was about 14. The first thought is you start thinking you're crazy, you know, because this isn't normal. At least that's what you think. And you're thinking you're the only one that's doing it. And then you get down the road and you start getting on a computer and you're like, wow, there's all these other people that are doing it. And then you find the name for it.
The name for Stanley's lifestyle is infantilism. For some participants, it's a kind of fetish. But Stanley's motivation to be a baby is not sexual.
For some people, being an adult baby is a sexual fetish for them. However, for most of us, it's just, you know, you're doing it to relax. You come.
Okay, so what I would like you to do now is and maybe you were doing it as you were watching the video, but is this behavior in the video abnormal according to the following approaches? And I want you to answer that, and then we will talk about this when I see you after break. So one thing it is my understanding, because I know the video cut off, that he does have a job. I mean, he said he spent about half his life, so he does have a job. Um, if that helps with any of your explanation. So that would be finishing part 2. Now let's move on to how do we classify disorders. So part of our purpose today is to not only be able to define, but to classify and label disorders. So when we're looking at the classifying disorders, why do we do this? It is to describe a disorder. Okay, and I just to go back here, I'm not sure why I've explained underline, so don't underline that. So when we look at classifying disorders, why do we do it? It helps us to describe a disorder as well as provide an appropriate treatment. So if somebody is diagnosed with depression, but they really have bipolar disorder, those treatments are very different. And it's incredibly important to have an accurate diagnosis so that the treatment is appropriate. Otherwise, it could harm the person more. So how do we collect information on a person to decide what their disorder is? You could have neurological tests, which would be a biological or biomedical approach. And the neurological tests could be, different things like actually measuring, putting them, the person, like scanning their brain. It could be doing neurological tests, like asking them questions and asking things on their memory. Objective tests, and this would be like the personality test that we took, and we have the MMPI-2, which is like 600 questions, and it can be used to help diagnose disorders. And then we have a clinical assessment, which is a mental status exam. So sitting down and talking with the person. So if a person goes to therapy, the first session is largely just asking symptoms and just getting some background information. And you would use an objective test. If it's kids, you might have teachers and parents fill out tests about their behavior. But here's some other things you'd be looking for in the clinical assessment. Is the person, what's their appearance? Does it look like they've showered recently? Are they wearing clothing appropriate for the weather? So if it's 90 degrees outside and the person has a winter coat on, okay, is that something that's noteworthy? Are they talking really fast? Are they talking really slow? So those would be different things you could look for in the clinical assessment. Now, when we look at how do we classify and put these disorders together, we have what's called the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders, 5th edition. And we will be looking at samples from the DSM-5. I do have a copy of it. And essentially what it is, the therapist, the psychologist would take a look at what the symptoms are and then go to the DSM-5 and see if that criteria fits underneath any of the disorders. And you can pretty much think of it kind of like a checklist. So somebody with depression might have to have, here's a category, and the person might have to have 3 of the 8 symptoms. And then here's another category, they might have to have 2 of the 8 symptoms. So again, I will show you what that looks like. So this does lead to labels, okay? And I'm going to have us skip the advantages and disadvantages for now, so don't write that down. But I do want you to write down this, okay? The Rosenhan experiment, okay, which is part of the labels. And then what we'll do is the advantages and disadvantages, okay? So you can leave space there, or you can put the Rosenhan experiment first. So what the Rosenhan experiment is, and I actually have a video to show you. This is Dr. Rosenhan here on the right. He was interested in how do people diagnose disorders, or what are the dangers of a label. And he had he had followed other people who had researched this. So previous psychiatric hospitals, he had started here by looking at somebody who had looked at hospitals in like the 1890s, which were really terrible conditions, and obviously had improved throughout time. But he wanted to see in the 1970s if somebody had a label, okay, would that change how they are treated, essentially. So his video here, or his experiment, is being sane in insane places. So this is a psychiatric hospital of the 1970s. Okay, we are going to kind of table the treatment and the hospitals until we get to the treatment part, but I want you to focus on the power of the label. Okay.
There might be a way of actually testing the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses. Can we really tell the sane from the insane? So one evening, there might be a way of actually testing the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses. Can we really tell the sane from the insane? So one evening he called some friends and students and asked them if they'd like to take part in an experiment. His idea was to see if they could get themselves admitted to hospitals as psychiatric patients, and surprisingly 7 of them, 3 women and 4 men, agreed. One of them, Martin Seligman, now himself a world-famous psychologist, later explained that Rosenhan could be very persuasive. And he had to be, because this was a tough assignment.
I think it'd been very frightening for the pseudo patients when they turn up. These institutions, very intimidating. They have a certain smell to them. However much you see pictures of them, it's nothing like walking in. It's a physical experience. You really can't put it into words. The smell, the experience, the feeling of the place, it's intimidating.
The would-be patients, none of whom had any history of psychiatric disorder, practiced their roles, including how to avoid swallowing the mass of tablets they'd be sure to be given. They stopped shaving, showering, and brushing their teeth, and 5 days later, they set off. And so began one of the most notorious experiments ever conducted in psychology, an experiment from which psychiatry never quite recovered. Rosenhan and his confederates travelled to 12 hospitals in 5 different states in the US. To try to get a more representative sample, some of the hospitals were old, some new, some were short-staffed, others well-staffed. After calling for an appointment, the would-be patients presented themselves at the hospitals. They didn't act crazy like Nellie Bly had done, they just faked a single symptom.
Yes, when the pseudo patients turn up at the hospital, they would just say, I'm hearing a voice and it's saying to me, hollow, empty, thud. And the significance of this is that it doesn't represent any known symptom of a schizophrenic disorder. So it's quite unique, it's made up. No one would have encountered anything like this before.
So Rosenhan was giving the doctors a chance here, and apart from saying they heard the voice and giving a false ID, everything else the pseudo-patient said was true. Significant events in their life were described exactly as they'd been.
And then what happened?
They were all diagnosed as insane and admitted to the hospital.
All of them?
All of them.
Once admitted, the pseudo-patient stopped faking the symptom and behaved in the way they usually did, hence the title of the study, being sane in insane places. When asked by staff how they were feeling, they said they were fine. The symptom had disappeared, and could they please be released? So what was Rosenhan trying to do here?
There were 2 aims to the study. The first one, principally, was to investigate psychiatric labels as to whether these would be used in situations where they weren't appropriate.
So this was first of all a field experiment, the independent variable being the lack of symptoms in the pseudo-patients once admitted, and the dependent variable, the responses of the staff. But this wasn't all.
And the second aim of the study was to get some data on what it's actually like to be a patient in a psychiatric hospital.
Being sane in insane places, then, was also a covert participant observation study of the experience of being hospitalised in a psychiatric ward. So what did Rosenhan and his confederates find? How long would it take for their sanity to be detected by the staff? And what would they find out about life on the inside?
With that, with the Rosenhan study, so their stays range from 7 to 52 days, with the average being 19 days, and all but one were discharged with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. And like it says here, Rosenhan considered this as evidence that mental illness is perceived as an irreversible condition and creates a lifelong stigma rather than a curable illness. So we're really looking at here the disadvantages of a label, that the person becomes the label. we look at the advantages of it, the intention is to get that person appropriate treatment. Now, I was researching here a little bit more, and I found this article from Psychology Today, which is really refuting the Rosenhan study and is discussing that these pseudo patients, it wasn't the doctor's fault, that it was the patients, and the study actually demonstrated the ability of patients to lie to doctors. So I do have the article here, and I will link it on Schoology if you're interested in taking a look at kind of a refute of the Rosenhan study. Nonetheless, it was incredibly significant. And when we look at treatment and deinstitutionalization, we will come back to the Rosenhan study. So we're going to take a little break from notes here. And what I would like you to do, based on everything that we've done, we just looked at the criteria for abnormal behavior. And one thing that I didn't do very well is that when we look at that maladaptive category, so that third category, if it is maladaptive, that's what can lead us to start considering that it may be a psychological disorder. Okay, the first two, with statistical frequency as well as the social norms, may not be a psychological disorder. It's just that it's abnormal because it's rare statistically, or it's breaking a norm. Okay, so when we look at that maladaptive, we really start to look at, is it a disorder? So I'd like you to take time right now and to look at part 3, is it a disorder? So you're going to read the scenario, determine if it's a disorder, what evidence you use to determine that, and then take a guess at what disorder you think it could be. And then when you're done with that, come back here for the last part of the lesson. So when we look at explaining psychological disorders, what we're going to do here is we have to ask ourselves, and you don't have to write this part down, okay? Write down C, but don't write down these bullets here. We're really asking ourselves, how do we explain thoughts and behaviors? And we're going to be using the 7 psychological perspectives. Now, I have been kind of bringing these up throughout the year. I like to teach these now instead of at the beginning of the year, because this is technically Unit 1 stuff, because we have learned so much throughout the year, and we can apply it directly to the disorders. Okay, so we're going to go over the 7 perspectives now. So before we get into that, when I look at a scenario, I want us to look at depression. Okay, so how can we explain why somebody would have depression? And the first aspect here is we could look at biological and how they have low levels of serotonin. Okay, so I would probably, you don't have to write this part down. Okay, the next part you will. So what we're looking at here is, if I were to explain somebody who has depression and I'm looking at it from a biological lens, that means that somebody has low levels of serotonin. That gives me a way to fix it. If I can increase the serotonin, then I can help the depression. So SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, could help with that. If I look at it from a cognitive lens, that a person with depression has a lot of negative thoughts, or ruminates on thoughts, gets stuck on thoughts. If I can change the way they think through cognitive therapy, then I can help symptoms of depression. And then finally, behavioral. So the behaviors may lead to symptoms of depression. So somebody who quits calling their friends, okay, and then their friends aren't calling them, they may be like reinforcing that behavior, be like, see, this is evidence that my friends don't like me. Okay, so, or if I call my friend and they stop answering, I may say, well, see, they don't like me anymore. It's almost like a punishment. So then you quit calling. Or lethargy leads to cessation of exercise, or the stopping of exercise. So when you stop exercising, that's a behavior, and that could lead to more fatigue. So this I do want you to write down. And what I did here is I looked at the 7 different perspectives that we have, put the unit that it ties with, and then I'm going to be putting some key terms down here. Okay, so the first one that I'm looking at is the biological. Okay, so the biological unit, here are some of the key terms: genes, hormones, nervous system, heredity. Largely with bio, you want to think everything we learned in Unit 2, that would be a biological perspective. Anything to do with the brain and the body, which actually add brain and body. I'm not sure why that's not on there. it should be. Okay, so brain, body, and then genes, hormones, nervous system, and heredity. So what do I inherit from my parents, for example? Okay, the next perspective is looking at cognitive. And this is looking at anything that has to do with thinking. So memory, reasoning, solving, beliefs. So pretty much everything that we looked at in unit 5 is going to be the cognitive perspective, which was these units. Okay, then the behavioral approach, and that should say behavioral, not just behavior. Okay, so the behavioral approach, we're going to look at everything we did in unit 4. So that's Pavlov's dogs, Watson's little Albert, Skinner's positive and negative reinforcement. So these are a lot of the buzzwords that we're going to look at for unit 4. And when I say environment, I'm talking immediate environment. So like my friends, my family. Okay, so the 4th and 5th perspectives we just looked at. So that's why I have unit 7 here. So the psychodynamic perspective would be explaining behavior from like the unconscious defense mechanisms and childhood experiences. So really think Freud-ish, because remember we took out some of the weird stuff with Freud, but looking at the role of that unconscious mind. Anytime you see unconscious, you have to think psychodynamic. And then humanistic is really that flip side. So this is where we looked at with Maslow and Rogers, self-actualization, free will, unconditional positive regard. When you see those types of things, that's going to be a humanistic. Now, for the last two, with sociocultural and evolutionary, we really have embedded these throughout the course. So sociocultural is going to be things like society and culture, social norms, taboos. So when we watch the adult baby, that would probably be considered taboo, that it's really forbidden in the culture. We would look at different things like that. Now, when I say social learning, what I'm looking at here is more big picture. So like the media, social media, the movies that we see, the social norms set by society. Okay, so that would be sociocultural. And then evolutionary, we've talked about throughout. Really, the big thing that we're looking at here is some buzzwords are going to be survival, natural selection. I should really add reproduction, like reproductive success in here. Then our ancestors. So not like our parents and grandparents. Our ancestors would be people that we all share. Okay, so from 1,000 years ago, those would be our ancestors. So the last thing that you're going to do, okay, is you are going to work on FAST 8.1, which is part 4, Psych Perspectives. And then when you're finished, I want you to submit it, and it is due tonight by 11:59. Okay, so you should be able to finish it in class. But when you're finished, you can submit and have a great break. Take care, everybody.